From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Our guest today is Seth Berenswijk, legal analyst and commentator. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you.
And on that basis, we shall go to issue 1, guns.
The Democrats are not strong at all in the Second Amendment. I would say they're weak on the Second Amendment.
Partisan disagreement on gun control is the rule in Washington. But on Washington streets and streets across America, gun violence is an all too common occurrence. With recent mass shootings taking dozens of innocent lives, Democrats sense that voters are ready for more aggressive action on gun control. They say that universal background checks should be just the starting point. Republicans see it differently. They say Democratic plans to limit magazine capacity limits and increase waiting periods are an affront to the Second Amendment.
Pat, is there an area within constitutional limits where Republicans should be willing to work with Democrats to find a gun safety solution?
Well, there certainly is in terms of background checks. People who have serious mental problems, people who are ex-cons who have used guns, and other categories should be denied weapons. There's no doubt about it. What this breaks down into and what brings it back up is basically the AK-47s and the AR-15s and mass killings with weapons that are built for war. And that's what brings the issue up. But what you get, Tom, is you get people standing by their fundamental position, tremendous apprehension among people with guns, that people do want to take away their Second Amendment rights. And on the other side, I think there is room, basically, I think, for
Would you ban assault rifles?
No, ban assault rifles. I mean, clearly there's certain people that shouldn't have assault rifles, but there are 10 million of them out there. There's 5 million Armalite 15 weapons. How are you going to get them off? I mean, do New Zealand try to confiscate them all? I don't think you could get it done.
Eleanor?
Nobody needs to have an assault weapon for hunting. They're for hunting people in war situations, and so that should be accomplished. And we had an assault weapons ban in the 90s that was allowed to lapse. So I think that's coming. The whole dynamics of the gun issue has shifted. Before, it was all the gun rights people who had all of the activism on their side. Now, with these mass shootings affecting more and more people, and people are changing their lives because they're afraid to go to shopping malls. You have kids doing these duck and cover things. It's really, it's traumatized the nation. And it's created a whole body of activists. Every time there's a mass shooting, more activists are created. You now have a whole conglomeration of groups on the gun control side that are outspending the NRA, and the NRA is in a state of collapse, infighting over the lavish spending habits of its leader. So we're approaching a tipping point on this issue, and I think in 2018 you really saw suburban women coming out in large. One of the reasons they came out in such strong numbers was because of the gun issue. So the politics of this have shifted from pro-GOP gun rights to pro-Democrat gun safety.
Seth?
Well, I think that the politics of this tends to get very hazy, but the law and the background of this is surprisingly clear. The modern version of the law regarding this was set by the Supreme Court about 12 years ago in the Heller case, where the Supreme Court overturned an attempt by the District of Columbia to have a full-scale banning of handguns for residents in D.C. And if you really boil it down, the Supreme Court in Heller did two things. One, it set the standard for protection for the bearing of arms under the Second Amendment, but it also was very clear to point out that the rights under the Second Amendment are not absolute. It went through various examples that we won't carry through here, but the bottom line is that there is certainly a way consistent with the Second Amendment to have meaningful gun legislation. So, for example, Congress has been talking about limiting removable large clips for certain kinds of armaments, and I think that that's something that could pass muster under the Second Amendment.
Clarence?
Indeed, that was Justice Scalia, as I recall. What was the Heller
grenade
decision,
launchers,
wasn't
right?
it? Sorry?
Said you couldn't buy a grenade launcher. The Second Amendment doesn't give you the right. I don't know if that was in an opinion or an obiter.
They talked about
but
that.
It has been. It's been a question. Fully automatic rifles, machine guns. Should you be able to have private ownership of that? Right now, technically, you can. They're heavily regulated, right. but there's there are areas that are debatable. As Pat was saying, as far as the assault weapons ban, as far as issues like the regulation of those really heavy weapons, we've got a consensus. I was thinking of background checks. Background checks have support of most NRA members. But trying to get them is hard. Wayne LaPierre, the effective operating head of the NRA, back in the 90s, said he favored background checks with no exceptions across the board until he started to get a political advantage, got more votes. So he didn't want to hear about them now.
Pat, let's bring in Pat.
The Thompson Submachine Gun,
Yes.
in the 1930s, was outlawed, and is still outlawed when it's a fully automatic weapon.
Right.
If you can get it neutered to a single-shot weapon, you can own one.
Well, the one similarity in all of these mass shootings is the kind of weapon that they're using, which, and also the bullets go out and they spread throughout the body. And in El Paso, what he fired, in 32 seconds, he wounded and killed more than 20 people. I mean, that should not be permitted. And they should put the doctors from the emergency rooms on TV and let them explain what it's like to do surgery on people who come in with these kind of gunshot wounds. And,
But the truth
it
is,
needs to be controlled.
But the truth is, the people, you take Baltimore, you take Detroit, you take St. Louis, you take Chicago, the killings, they're basically inner city killings by kids and things, or young gang members with pistols. They're not with Armalite rifles and the rest of it. I think there are 33,000 homicides each year. 2/3 of these are suicides.
Here's a question.
Well, in that regard, I view the gun issue a lot like that of opiates. As long as it was viewed as a ghetto problem, people didn't care about it that much. But then when it started hitting suburban kids and high schools and families out in wider areas, then suddenly you started getting some political impetus. I think the same thing is happening with the gun issue.
All right, I have a little round table. I want to go here and ask this question. Democrats talk about the idea, and some states, California and New York, have already passed it, about magazine capacity limits. Do we believe, based on the holding in the Heller Washington case and Chicago McDonald, that it would be constitutional to ban handguns, magazines above 10 rounds? I don't think it would be constitutional.
You don't?
I don't.
That's interesting.
What do you think, Seth?
I think it would be constitutional. It would be subject to a knockdown, drag-out fight, but I actually believe that would pass the litmus test that the Supreme Court has passed down.
Even
since
though
Heller.
most their target about 30% of the time. So a homeowner, if they have 10 rounds in their magazine and they miss, they're vulnerable. No?
Well, it's a very
Dayton.
difficult issue, but if you look at it in the legal standard, I think that would pass. Okay. The other thing that I would drop a footnote to here is that I'm always so fascinated, where's ATF? How are we, with respect to the funding of ATF, to try to get some of these guns off the street? So I think that there's a few things that fall into the equation.
But the drum magazine, that guy in Dayton, I think he had 2 drums. I think he had 100 bullets.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Well,
that's not 10 rounds
per drum.
Yeah, and
10 rounds.
I mean that's
There's a
what
mixed picture there,
that's
though.
what the Thompson Submachine Gun has also, a drum magazine. I think you're correct. I don't think there.
All right.
People would say there's a constitutional right to fire off 100 rounds at once.
10 rounds.
Police show up with weapons where they're outmatched. I mean, again, let's have a little reality here. Is this the world we want to live in? And that Supreme Court decision, it was 5-4.
True.
And I don't see the Supreme Court changing in the immediate future, but that's not set in stone.
On the issue of the magazines, Congresswoman Giffords, when she was shot out in Arizona, the guy who shot her had, as I recall, 18-round magazines with him, several spares. He was caught when he went to change magazines. Then several guys jumped on top of him. If he had had the 99-round cylinder clip and it didn't jam, they do have a bad problem with jamming, but it didn't jam, he could have wreaked a lot lot more havoc out there. So that's why people started suddenly pushing for smaller magazines.
We'll move on. In my opinion, it would be constitutional to ban when you get to the maximum high capacity limits, but 10 rounds with a handgun, I think that's dangerous territory constitutionally. Anyway, issue 2, the border.
The immigration crisis at the southern border continues. Immigration courts are clogged with unprecedented backlogs. Children are suffering. Detention facilities are overwhelmed. But Republicans and Democrats remain deadlocked in disagreement over how to fix the problem. Democrats, especially 2020 presidential hopefuls, say that the U.S. must make it easier and safer for immigrants to claim asylum. Led by President Trump, Republicans say border security is the paramount priority.
Eleanor, is bipartisan immigration reform dead for the foreseeable future?
Yes, because it's a political issue that the president is going to hope to drive to his re-election. Every country needs to protect its borders. And Democrats there aren't any Democrats running on open borders, although president will try to make it seem as though that's so. But the president's policies are gratuitously cruel, and he refuses to really acknowledge the fact that these are desperate families trying to come across the border, that they are presenting themselves legally. It could be addressed rather logically by having more immigration lawyers tend to them, by having facilities that accommodate women and children as opposed to single men coming across just looking for work. So it's easily fixable, but the president doesn't want to fix it. He wants to make it worse so he can use all his favorite words, that this is an invasion, and words that have really been used to incite some extremists to take action into their own hands.
Well, look, you get 100,000 people a month coming to the southern border of the United States. You're going to get 1 million this year. You've got 11 million in the country. If you can call a guy coming into your house a home invasion, I think the word invasion is a legitimate weapon to say what is going on in the Western world, not only in the United States, but in Europe. What is happening is an explosion of populations in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, access to America. This is going to be the greatest issue, I think, of our time. It's certainly going to be the primary issue on the border. The one area, the one area where the liberals have a point is nobody wants to see little kids in cages. And that's a very emotional issue, and you got to deal with that. But if you're talking about who wants to secure America's borders, the sanctuary city folks who want to abolish ICE aren't the ones you want to rely on.
I'm going out of order here, but I've just got to say, I just read a headline this morning that said, U.S. employers say, we need immigrants. The country is not full. They need workers.
Well, if they want people walking across the border, they can't have it.
All right, Clarence.
Well, that's where the debate gets really screwed because people are not advocating open borders, but so many Donald Trump and others are acting like we do. The fact is that both sides need to address the real issues: border protection and refugees. We're not talking about invaders. We're talking about people coming here legally to apply for asylum and then being told, no, you can't come in. You got to sit over in Laredo or South Laredo.
Let's let Seth in.
Well, a lot of the things that we're talking about here have created a tsunami of litigation that is bubbling forward and kind of bursting through the doors of the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is still sifting through a lot of that wreckage, but in the late summer timeframe, they did issue one ruling against the Sierra Club saying that they don't have standing to try to challenge the president's declaration of a national emergency to try to get funds to unilaterally build the wall. And what you've seen a lot of the dynamics here, particularly in Washington, is that you have the executive litigating in the judiciary. That's really not the way this is supposed to be happening. If you're going to have major breakthrough on this kind of an issue that so deeply affects America, then the people's representatives need to step forward. It needs to be something that's leaning forward in Congress, not to continue to have this litigation going through the courts challenging the president.
This is going to be litigated in November 2020.
And who will be the political it's obviously it's a big human issue, it's a big security issue, but who in the political sense, Pat, do you think will be the beneficiary? President Trump or his Democratic opponent?
I think President Trump will be. As I mentioned, there's the emotional issue of the cages, no doubt about it. It's got to be dealt with. But this is going to be an issue. I mean, this isn't going to stop. This is about what the fate of Western civilization and the tremendous growth in populations. I mean, Africa's doubled the population. It's going to have 4 billion people there by 2100.
We can deal with the kids in cages issue. Trump wants to spend unlimited amounts of money to build a wall, which we know ain't going to work. But how much is he willing to spend on facilities for housing?
The wall worked in the West Bank.
The
wall worked in the West Bank.
The West Bank is a lot shorter than what we're talking about. 1,100 miles. I mean, that ain't the West Bank.
That is fair.
Talking about refugee issues around the world, I mean, you make some good points there, and they are going to be worsened by the climate change that is coming upon us. You can roll your eyes at that, but it's true. droughts and crops and in various parts of the world are going to drive people to leave their homelands. But that's a whole different issue.
Greenland is going to be available because the ice is going to melt.
We're talking about our southern border here, and a president that wants to detain people indefinitely in violation of really U.S. law and international norms, not giving people due process.
If they're
when this
refugees,
country has the Statue of Liberty in its harbor welcoming immigrants, including your
Quickly,
family
Pat.
and my
if you got
family.
somebody who's fleeing persecution in Guatemala and they cross the border into Mexico, that's where they should get asylum.
And
the first country out.
And Seth, I was actually going to, and you can go on to the point you wanted to make, but
Sure.
on that legal point, do you think the administration has an argument to make in terms of people who apply for asylum and then disappear, that actually it is a gimmick in some ways, that you should have more safeguards to ensure that?
It's certainly in part a valid argument for some of these cases, but the problem is that the immigration court system is so underfunded and is such an unbelievable backlog of hundreds of thousands of cases over many years that it doesn't work for so many reasons. In this one instance, I do think that the president has a good argument, at least in part when he looks at Congress and asks where they are on this with regard to comprehensive immigration reform. Now, I know that this is something that has come through other administrations as well, but for something of this kind of national importance, the people's representatives need to step forward and really exercise their constitutional authority. They won't, and there's no indication of that.
Maybe in a non-election year, maybe.
In 2013, the Senate passed with 68 votes comprehensive immigration reform. 2 subsequent Republican speakers refused to bring it to a vote because they could not get the majority of Republicans to support it. So we know the enemy. The enemy are the Republicans in this case. They do not want to vote on this.
Concluding comment, Trump.
Look, take a look at the
I called
votes.
you
You
Trump
want to
there for a
know
second.
why folks are electing authoritarian, populist rulers. Take a look at the immigration issue. They think these are the only folks who will defend the country.
And that's good.
That's necessary.
You've written about that.
I've written occasionally on that.
All right. On that basis, has everyone else here read Pat's books on this issue?
He was Trump before Trump.
All right,
and
on that.
That's right.
And he thinks that's
All
a
right,
compliment.
we're moving on. Issue 3, power over war.
Continuing tensions between the US and Iran raise the specter of another conflict in the Middle East. But what power does President Trump have to go to war? Well, in 1973, Congress passed a War Powers Resolution preventing the president from unilaterally using military force in a major conflict or for a prolonged period of time absent congressional approval. But the resolution has never been tested by constitutional challenge. And note this, in another War Powers-related concern this April, the president vetoed a congressional resolution calling for an end to U.S. military support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
Seth, would President Trump face any serious legal restraint, either through Congress or the courts, were he to authorize a significant use of military force against Iran?
Well, it depends. Hate to sound like a lawyer, but he would probably have support. Certainly, I think that for the most part, he'd have some political support. But look, for example, at what happened with respect to the downing of the U.S. drone by Iran. In
Two now.
Yes, and I think that under the War Powers Act, which Congress gave us in the early 70s, the president is authorized to take limited defensive military measures as long as he or she keeps the Congress informed. So I think that the president would be able to do that. He had that opportunity with the downing of the first drone, and supposedly we were 10 minutes away from making it happen. He had his Gulf of Tonkin moment. Apparently he did not seize upon it.
Eleanor?
You know, I don't have any belief in the fact that our constitutional protections will save us from Donald Trump's impetuous moves. And as we move into the election season that's ahead, and the president is worried about a declining, possibly slowing economy, he seems to be more and more off the rails. And I think there's genuine concern about him taking some sort of action, irrational action, whether it be with the economy or whether it be overseas. So it's really nice to talk about the War Powers Act, and I'm all for it. But I think that there's not much standing between us and whatever Donald Trump wants to do.
Pat?
I don't think Clinton had the authorization to go into war against Serbia. But I can tell you this, and I'm not for a war with Iran, but if you had some kind of collision over tankers and drones, and the United States, Mr. Trump ordered a shooting war, or a modified shooting war against Iran, the Congress of the United States would back him up, and they would not demand authorization, and they would not impeach him for that. Because look, when it comes to the actions of military action by presidents, look, Congress have surrendered their rights and authority long ago under the not only the War Powers Act, the constitutional authority of Congress of the United States to authorize war.
And Clarence, President Obama didn't ask Congress for approval to use force in Libya. So there is a trend here of presidents perhaps being, although President Bush did with Iraq and Afghanistan.
We haven't declared war since World War II. How many wars have we fought in that amount of time?
Quite a few.
You know, yeah, absolutely. No, if there's any area that Congress is willing to look the other way, let the president do what he or someday she wants, it is when it comes to war powers. And this is what disturbs me also about President Trump. He's gotten away with so much so far, foreign and domestic. And Congress, as long as he knows he's got one house of Congress that's mostly Republican, then he feels like he can get away with anything. What does that mean for the future as far as presidents are concerned?
Seth, what about the idea in terms of one of the reasons where we might say that there is good cause to have deference to the executive on the use of military force is the worst day in history, the nuclear war scenario.
Right.
What do you think there's getting into the legal weeds there, perhaps that's what the founders, obviously they couldn't think of nuclear, but they could think of terrible conflict, and they wanted to ultimately have one person ready to defend the country.
Sure. Well, they in essence did that to the core with respect to the president's constitutional authorization to conduct war. That's counterbalanced constitutionally with the Congress's authority to declare war. The idea under the War Powers Act was to find this theoretically elegant middle ground, to try to find some plumbing in the middle to bring them together. But as Eleanor correctly says, fast forward to today, where we're living tweet by tweet, the presumption under the War Powers Act and that kind of presumptive coordination between the branches of government is really not at play right now.
And you have a supine Republican Senate there that's going along with everything.
Let's get some balance in, Pat.
There was no declaration of war in the Desert Storm Iraq War.
There was in Iraq 2003.
Bush got authorization for that. And we got authorization to go into Afghanistan because of Al-Qaeda, what they had done on 9/11. But a lot of the presidents have used that authorization from Afghanistan for all these other exercises, saying we're dealing with the war on terror. This is an aspect of the war on terror.
But I think
Congress has been fighting back over the Yemen war.
I apologize for that. I think the problem with Iran is that in the backdrop where you don't have the president and the Congress in any way really coordinating with each other, if we don't get out ahead of Iran, Iran's going to get out ahead of us. Every week there's the possibility of an escalation, and given the deterioration of that relationship, it's very difficult to know what's going to happen week by week as it relates to Iran. So, and in the meantime, when representatives from the White House have been on the Hill and asking whether they're going to continue to seek authorization before they take action, their answers have been pretty cagey and evasive. So if we don't act quickly, then Iran can get ahead of us and things could spark at any moment.
Does anyone here think that when we look at this issue, there is, with younger people certainly, that there is more coalescence around the idea of greater congressional approval? We see sort of Rand Paul, for example, leading that charge. That's his outreach with younger conservatives. Is there?
You're in better touch with younger conservatives than I am. I don't feel like these are front burner issues for young people. They're much more interested in domestic issues, in climate and guns and health care.
The possibility of draft, though.
A possibility. Well, that
definitely care about that.
Boy, the president has ceded an enormous amount of authority and freedom of action, and to go. I mean, if somebody does something and Americans are killed, bam, and then the Congress will, yes, sir, well done. The only time Congress will rise up is when the war goes bad.
Yep.
The thing is, we are in such a different time here. I mean, you draw a scenario where a president's response would be sort of rational, expected, and applauded, I suppose. And I don't have any confidence. No, I don't have any confidence that would play out today.
But the Congress, unless it was some madman act, but if the President of the United States, in response to something, struck Iran, I can tell you, if it's close to the election, his support would go up, And the Congress of the United States, I wouldn't rely upon them to do a thing.
I agree with you, but wag the dog comes to mind. And the lengths to which this president is likely to go to try to win re-election.
Why doesn't Nancy Pelosi say, write a resolution, you have no authority to take us to war against Iran?
It's hard for Democrats to do that without being called wimps or something or other. But I mean, I've seen Trump though push back against John Bolton and others who have urged.
Well, Trump is the reason we're not in war with
Iran. All right,
let's
just get. All right, we're running.
The pushback on Yemen didn't work because the Congress tried to move forward and try to limit our involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and that got vetoed.
Okay.
So there's
all right, forced prediction. Forced prediction. All right, we're starting with you, Pat.
Right.
If President Trump is re-elected in 2020, will John Bolton remain the National Security Advisor for the rest of 2021? Yes or no?
Yes.
Eleanor?
I
think yes. I don't think people are lining up to replace him.
Okay.
I agree. I would say.
Clarence?
I agree with that. And Trump will just not listen to him. He doesn't feel like it.
Well, Trump seems to have a lot of people. Who does Trump listen to the most? Pompeo?
No, Steve Miller.
Okay. All right. On that note, I think John Bolton will be staying in office. If President Trump is re-elected, he'll stay through 2021, if only so Trump can shout at him. Anyway, thank you, panel, for that wonderful discussion. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.